Hello, so I'm recording this lecture. I'm going to use a lot of different formats in the class. So we've used MS Teams, and we also met over Zoom. And so now I'm going to do this recording, and I'm going to discuss race and racism and the anthropological gaze. And I'm specifically going to talk about the ways that anthropology as a discipline has historically been implicated in colonial knowledge production and has now, in many ways, or in many articles and recent publications in the field of anthropology, there is often this um, gesture or will to decolonize. And this is true in many disciplines in the liberal arts and humanities. So I'm going to discuss anthropology and the idea of the colonial gaze, the decolonization, and I'm also going to discuss social movements that attempt to redress crimes and moral failings regarding race. So I will discuss social movements that politicize the ongoing reification of cultural and racial difference, which gives the illusion of categorical difference. And what I mean by this is that many social movements that fight against racism also emphasize over and over again that there is no race. We are not distinct from each other. And classifications, categorizations of human beings as being different from each other, distinct from each other, is part of colonial history. So uh, the will to kind of know and to produce knowledge about others and to then classify them in relation to oneself as being the center of the universe and the kind of objective um, author or the objective the objective researcher who produces knowledge about others uh, is a facet of colonialism. So, post colonial theorists, critical race theorists, feminist theorists, and queer theorists have all challenged this idea of objective knowledge produced from the vantage point of colonial power. And as I mentioned in the first two lectures, there have been prominent academics like Sandra Harding, Gayatri Spivak, who have all challenged this idea of objective knowledge production. So for the purposes of this class, I will discuss race and racism. And throughout the entire class, I think we will always come back to these questions about knowledge and knowledge production. How do we know certain things? Who has the authority to produce knowledge? Who can produce knowledge that is seen to be credible? Um, who produces knowledge as a form of saleable capital? Whose knowledge is actually criminalized or banned? Um, so how can certain subjects produce knowledge that makes them uh, capital and that also allows them to enter the bourgeoisie or the petite bourgeoisie? And how do other people produce knowledge that actually makes them more vulnerable and precarious and susceptible to policing and to death? So I will share my screen and we'll look at the PowerPoint together, which I'll also post on the Moodle for our class. So one of my areas of research was critical race theory. It was the ways that race and racism is really a construction. It often involved a whole series of um, tropes, language, narrative, media, and visual construction that give way to this seamless performance of an essential identity. Similar to gender and Judith Butler's understanding of gender, which we'll discuss throughout the class, I would argue that race is performative. There is no real race. Who I'm considered to be or what my aesthetics or name mean in one context would change in another. There are also a whole series of performatives that often involve occupying a certain class position, a certain neighborhood, um, that are really localized performatives of ethnicity and race. So I was also interested then in the ways that media constructs um, categories of persons and how signs and signifiers of color or name are used to discuss political phenomenon. So the language of terror and terrorism is a central trope or a central narrative in our time period. Um, the use of religious difference and class position as race, I think, offers evidence of the ways that ethnicity and race, the idea of racial difference, is what Stuart Hall referred to as a floating signifier. So a sign is comprised of a signifier and the signified. So I could think of water, for example. And so when I think of water, I think of the actual object or substance of water. I then think of the word water. So the sign is both the idea in my head of water, which comes from the tap, but in this case, I have 8 bottles. So my idea of water is actually this kind of store-bought fancy water, Perrier. And I use the term water. Obviously, what this means is that a sign does not mean the same thing for all of us. So if I said, do you have any water, to somebody who uh, pumps water out of a well, they might say, yes, I have lots of water, but they might not mean this. And so our understanding of what constitutes shared meaning is obviously always under contestation. And as Stuart Hall, a Marxist, argues, what forms the basis of our conflict regarding shared meaning is class antagonism. So one person's water is not another person's water. No. And so the sign water then can never mean the same thing. And this kind of struggle over what something means, what a sign means, what is water in each society, is really about class antagonism. And when we're in this constant conflict or debate regarding what signs mean, this conflict or debate can tell us a lot about society. So if we think about woman, A woman is one of the greatest examples, I think, that we could think about in any time period. What should women do? What does the average woman do? Um, what often make women happy? I mean, obviously, there's so many different answers. And as I discussed in the previous lecture regarding the rise of far right politics, the contestations regarding women and good women, um, successful successful women, happy women, really are really central to the rise of Republican and far right politics, and to opposition to these politics. Um, the transgender rights movement and the queer rights movement have also changed our understandings of gender identity and the ways that gender identity informs life choices. So, this sign is always in constant conflict or is a site of debate. And this is also true of race. There are people who have argued that we obviously live in a post racial world where people don't constantly think about ethnicity or difference in terms of skin color, appearance. Unless one knows a person or has a reason to engage with them, they might not think about their personal biography, um, or their appearance a great deal. There are others who would say that in our time period, um, the work of race has actually become even more extreme, um, and has justified the killing of minors by police. So, race is a sign or a whole series of signs and sign systems that is in constant debate and conflict. And what one person says about race as opposed to another can tell us a lot about um, really different attitudes towards life, towards politics, towards class, even in one place or one city. So in the same city, you can meet people who kind of constantly think that we are racializing each other, that we are part of different ethnic communities, that our employment and our life chances are always about race. In another part of the same city, you will meet people who live in a kind of post-racial world and they don't ever talk about race or think about it. And it's interesting to think about then how class informs these huge gaps in our ideological understandings of race. So I will discuss race. Um, and as I said, I'm kind of experimenting with different styles of lecturing. Anthropology has not been able to escape this central paradox of modernity. And while the discipline of anthropology promises that it applies universally and equally to all of its practitioners, it still faces these accusations of denying equal access to those labeled as other. So, this kind of equal access is really again about knowledge production. Who produces knowledge about who? In the classical story of anthropology, there is the anthropologist who stands at a distance from a tribe of people, from a small, say, group of people living in a remote place in the global south. And the anthropologist has has their binoculars, they take notes, they observe these others, and then they construct categories and narratives about their lives. And obviously, this kind of classical anthropology has come under scrutiny from post-colonial and critical race scholars. The feminist and queer movement have obviously critiqued this kind of anthropological gaze because it allows one to make authorial claims about other people's lives. And the claims often begin from this perspective of hierarchy and difference about race or regarding race. So one begins a certain research inquiry from the position of an objective scholar. And this objective scholar often has more financial and racial capital, more privilege than those that whom they're observing. And this colonial gaze structures all authorial claims and research endeavors. And therefore, anthropology has often been accused of being complicit in colonization. So when we produce knowledge about people, this sense of authority allows us to often enact forms of colonial governance over a colonized people. So the 21st century calls for a new third wave of decolonizing decolonizing anthropology, fueled by neighboring disciplines. There is an unease about the unbearable whiteness of anthropology, and this is true of many disciplines. It's true of a lot of disciplines in the liberal arts and humanities. There have been social movements like Black Lives Matter and Roads Must Fall that show that anthropology's decolonizing waves are never complete. So, this critique of decolonization also asks us to question the validity of earlier truth claims made by anthropologists. Michel Foucault discusses the concept of a regime of truth. And Foucault argues that truth is not just objective, it is relative and it is performative, it is repetitive. So, a regime of truth often involves speaking over and over again about a certain set of ideas until the illusion of truth appears. And so the truth claims the regime of truth is a way of constructing a certain set of ideas. And rather than a mirror that could be held up to a sociological phenomenon, narrative allows us to tell the truth in a certain language over and over again. So it is in the telling that truth is actually enacted as a performative, or truth becomes the result of a series of reiterative performatives. Over and over again, we tell the truth. And when we tell the truth, we formulate truth. So, truth itself is not mimesis, it is performative, meaning that if I repeat over and over again that there is race, then I am creating a discourse of race that becomes true in all of my enactments, that I make true through enunciation, through repetition, through performatives. Classification is also central to anthropology. Anthropologists love to classify. The topos of classification, once central to disciplinary rhetoric, but somewhat neglected since, in an attempt to rethink this central paradox in an anthropologically constructed way. Classification played a crucial role in the emergence and professionalization of the discipline. Economic classification of human differences was an almost unquestioned question methodology of mid 19th century scientific racism. Although um, it was never free from critique. So, throughout the whole history of anthropology, this desire to classify everything has always been subject to critique. And uh, colonizers, and specifically European colonizers, loved classification. There was Linnaeus, who decided he was going to classify everything in the entire world. And he classified plants, he classified people, he classified trees, he classified tribes, he classified sex. This classification formed the basis of his uh, of colonization. I mean, the kind of colonial archives produced by those who were obsessed with classification then led to the use of different systems of labor, enslavement, indenture to put people in their rightful places. So once people were put in place by language, they could be put in place by eviction or by exploitation. So anthropology, as mentioned in the previous lecture, can be a very politicized area of study. And scholar activists often use critical theory and they use different scholarly ideas to discuss social movements. Black Lives Matter was created in 2012 after Trayvon Martin's murderer George Zimmerman was acquitted for his crime, and dead 17-year-old Trayvon was posthumously placed on trial for his own murder. Rooted in the experience of Black people in this country who actively resist our dehumanization, Black Lives Matter states that the movement is a call to action and a response to the virulent anti Black racism that permeates our society. Black Lives Matter is a unique contribution that goes beyond extrajudicial killings of Black people by police and by vigilantes. So, Black Lives Matter is a social movement that has gained a great deal of attention in this time. And there's a long history of activism against anti Black racism that obviously dates back to slavery. Um, some of the most impressive post colonial scholars of our time interrogated anti Black racism and other forms of racial discrimination and anti Semitism. Um, some of the foundational scholars in the liberal arts and humanities were Jewish scholars who were exiled because of the Holocaust. Scholars like Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Karl Marx, Hannah Arendt, all uh, discuss anti Semitism and the idea of humanity after the Holocaust. So, how do we engage in politics, or how do we engage with the world without authoritarianism, without without fascism? And what does it mean to have an ethical life that involves trying to bear witness to the suffering of others, to the needs of others, and trying to be judicious um, without enacting violence against others. Frantz Fanon is one of the most well-cited post-colonial scholars of our time. In Black Lives Matter, or sorry, in Black Skin, White Masks, Frantz Fanon discusses the fact of Blackness. And while race is written of as a social construct, as a phenomenologist, Frantz Fanon is interested in the way that race is material. It is something that we experience because of skin color, because of our embodiments. And so Fanon draws on phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty, who is interested in experience. So for Merleau-Ponty, there is more than language, there is the actual body. So we experience things, we experience touch, we experience smell, we experience the world in our bodies. We experience the relationality between our bodies and others. We also experience our ancestry, and our ancestry takes us to different places, perhaps. And so Fanon draws on Merleau-Ponty to discuss the fact of Blackness and the ways that one's identity as a person of color, and in the case of Frantz Fanon, a Black man, is always informed by race and by discrimination. Fanon writes, I came into the world imbued with the will to find a meaning in things, my spirit filled with the desire to attain to the source of the world, and then I found that I was an object in the midst of other objects. Sealed into that crushing objecthood, I turned beseechingly to others. Their attention was a liberation running over my body, suddenly abraded into non-being, endowing me once more with an agility that I had thought that I had lost. And by taking me out of the world, restoring me to it. But just as I reached the other side, I stumbled, and the movements, the attitudes, the glances of the other fixed me there, in the sense in which a chemical solution is fixed by a dye. I was indignant. I demanded an explanation. Nothing happened. I burst apart. Now the fragments have been put together again by another self. Fanon writes, as long as the Black man is among his own, he will have no occasion, except in minor internal conflicts, to experience his being through others. There is, of course, the moment of being for others, of which Hegel speaks, but every ontology is made unattainable in a colonized and civilized society. It would seem that this fact has not been given sufficient attention by those who have discussed the question. Fanon further states, in the white world, the man of color encounters difficulties in the development of his bodily schema. Consciousness of the body is solely a negative activity. It is a third-person consciousness. The body is surrounded by an atmosphere of certain uncertainty. This certain uncertainty forms the basis of Frantz Fanon's discussion about race as a process that affects one's mind and psychology and mental health. That this certain uncertainty means that one is always unstable because of the work of race. So when somebody crosses a border or tries to collect their passport, when they try to fly in a plane, when a person tries to buy something in a certain neighborhood, there is always this certain uncertainty of work of race. And for Fanon, this is particularly true, he argues, for himself as a Black man. Fanon further writes, in the Weltanschauung of a colonized people, there is an impurity, a flaw that outlies any ontological explanation. Someone may object that this is the case with every individual, but such an objection merely conceals a basic problem. Ontology, once it is finally admitted as leaving existence by the wayside, does not permit us to understand the being of a Black man. So, ontology is an interesting philosophical concept that we can think about in relation to anthropology and to sociology. Ontology is the branch of metaphysics dealing with the nature of being. It is a set of concepts and categories in a subject area or domain that shows their properties and the relations between them. So, ontology is the philosophical study of being. It is traditionally understood as the subdiscipline of metaphysics, and it is focused on the most general features of reality. So ontology is really a concept in philosophy that deals with reality. And it is the study of being. As one of the most fundamental concepts of philosophy, it encompasses all reality and every entity within it. Ontologists often disagree or debate as to what constitutes reality. They employ diverse methods of inquiry, including the analysis of concepts and experience. And so, what does it mean to really be alive? What is reality? Ontology looks at these very basic questions. And so for Frantz Fanon, ontology is inextricable from race. Fanon writes, for not only must the Black man be Black, he must be Black in relation to the white man. Some critics will take it on themselves to remind us that this proposition has a converse. I say that this is false. The Black man has no ontological resistance in the eyes of the white man. So ontological resistance for Fanon is a resistance to racialization. So what the racist wants for Frantz Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks is for his entire being to be bound to this idea of Blackness as a form of, as an identity that is not self-constituted, but placed onto the other. So, as we discussed, epistemic violence for Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak refers to the violence of knowledge production, the production of knowledge about one's about another, speaking on someone else's behalf. So, ontological violence involves doing violence to one's to someone's personhood or subjecthood by forcing them to know themselves through categorizations like race or gender or class. This is why self-identification is very important in this time period. So finally, I'll finish by discussing a concept from Sadia Hartman. Fungibility, fungibility is a concept from Sadia Hartman, sorry. So Sadia Hartman's theory of fungibility uses the concept of the fungible or movable commodity to discuss slavery. When something is a fungible commodity, it is kind of like a stock or bonds that one can move um, to different bank accounts. Uh, Slavery is discussed in a similar vein by Saidiya Hartman. The role of gender and sexual differentiation in the constitution of labor are especially complex in the context of slavery. On one hand, the category of labor insufficiently accounts for slavery as a mode of power, domination, and production. The fungibility of the slave, uh, the wanton uses of the Black body for producing value or pleasure, and the shared vulnerabilities of the commodity, whether male or female, trouble dominant accounts of gender. Depending on the angle of Anglovision or critical lexicon, the harnessing of the body as an instrument for social and physical reproduction unmakes the slave as gendered subject or reveals the primacy of gender and sexual differentiation in the making of the slave. So, one interesting aspect of this movability or fungibility or floating signifier of race and this kind of shifting nature of power or subjectivity in the life and afterlife of slavery is gender and sex. And this is something that Hartman discusses in detail. And Saidiya Hartman is really interested in the ways that gender and the reproductive body, the sexed body, is inextricable from slavery. So Hartman discusses natal alienation. Natal alienation is one of the central attributes of the social death of the slave, and gendered and sexual violence are central to the processes that render the Black child as byproduct of the relations of production. At the same time, the lines of division between the market and the household, which distinguish the public and the domestic, and divided productive and reproductive labor for propertied whites, does not hold when describing the enslaved and the carceral landscape of plantations. Reproduction is tethered to the making of human commodities and in service of the marketplace. For the enslaved, reproduction does not ensure any future other than that of dispossession, nor guarantee anything other than the replication of disposable persons, or human increase, expanded property holdings for the master. The future of the enslaved was a form of speculative value for slaveholders. Even the unborn were conscripted and condemned into slavery. So, childbirth means very different things to different people. As I discussed in previous lectures, uh, the Michael Dobbs versus Jackson Health Organization um, lawsuit uh, in the Supreme Court of the United States of America banned abortion partially throughout America. The birth of children uh, is a highly tendentious issue, and it always has been. Hartman writes of the complex politics and the trauma and also rebellion of the birth of those who would be born into slavery and those who would run from slavery. At the heart of this conscription and rebellion is Black feminism. Saidiya Hartman writes sorry, the systematic violence needed to conscript Black women's domestic labor after slavery required locking them out of all other sectors of the labor market, a condition William Patterson described as economic genocide. Race riots, the enclosure of the ghetto, the vertical order of human life, and the forms of value and debt promulgated through emergent forms of racism, what Sarah Haley termed Jim Crow modernity, made it impossible for Black women to escape the white household. And so Hartman discusses the long history of Black women as forced domestic workers or as coerced domestic workers who are conscripted to a role that required them to care for and replenish the needs of the white household and tend to the daily activities necessary for its maintenance. And they were forced to perform the affective and communicative labor necessary for the sustenance of white families at the expense of their own needs and their own familiar needs. So, again, the politics of childbirth, of the refusal to construct Black women as being women who are on a par with white women, uh, is obviously a form of racism, or authors have termed misogynoir, which is specifically misogyny directed at Black women. However, simultaneously, uh, forcing Black women into reproductive roles of childbirth and child care, of tending to the needs of the household, is obviously highly discriminatory. So finally, I will finish by discussing care, drawing on Saidiya Hartman. Care is a really interesting idea, and it is in circulation in social media. Um, Care sounds good, and it has a great deal of rhetorical resonance. We love the idea that people care for each other and must care for others. Care also often is used to it's used as a weapon against narcissists and narcissism. However, care is very violent. The violent structures of slavery, anti Black racism, virulent sexism, and disposability all, on the one hand, gesture to the carelessness of society, but they also ask us to care. Should we care? In what way do we care? Um, do people really want us to care? And if we do, for how long and in what capacity? Under the guise of care, missionaries forcibly took mass numbers of indigenous children from their parents and put them into forced residential schooling. This kind of care is really uh, colonialism. The forms of care, intimacy, and sustenance exploited by racial capitalism, most importantly, are not reducible to or exhausted by it. These labors cannot be assimilated to the template or grid of the Black worker, but instead nourish the latent text of the fugitive. They enable those who were never meant to survive to sometimes do just that. This care, which is coercive, which coerced and freely given, is the black heart of our social justice voices of making and relation. At the same time, care can be very violent. Those who care too much about what people do, and specifically about what people of color do, can stalk people of color, can watch people of color, can put people of color under surveillance, and can police and kill people of color. Why would they care? Care is also obviously about the class structure. It is ideological. The ruling ideology will always be the ideology of the ruling class. So envisioning us all to care about the certain things is also the work of class. Judith Butler has written extensively about Black Lives Matter, and Butler has written against the phrase "all lives matter." And um, Judith Butler has also written an article about the murder of Rodney, or the beating of Rodney King in Los Angeles and the Los Angeles riots. Butler states the police see a threat where there is no gun to see, or someone is subdued and crying out for his life when they are moving away or cannot move. These figures are perceived as threats, even when they do not threaten, when they have no weapon. And the video footage that shows precisely this is taken to be a ratification of the police's perception. The perception is then ratified as a public perception, at which point we not only must insist on the dignity of Black lives, but name the racism that has become ratified as public perception. So, how does police perception become public perception? This can be because of media. It can be because of the fear that the public has about the police, or the extent to which the public might fear um, saying things that do not mimic authority could also inform our ideas of, or our public perception. Butler writes that the norm of whiteness that supports violence and inequality insinuates itself into the normal and the obvious, understood as the sometimes tacit and sometimes explicit power to define the boundaries of kinship, community, and nation. Whiteness inflects all those frameworks within which certain lives are made to matter less than others. So, this kind of norm, which Judith Butler writes, which inflects all frameworks, makes certain lives normative, valuable, and really makes them lives. Um, the abnormal is often seen to be deviant and pathological, and therefore can be removed. As Stuart Hall draws on Mary Douglas, the anthropologist, uh, what Douglas argues when discussing, or what Stuart Hall draws on Mary Douglas's idea of matter out of place. And matter out of place is matter that does not belong in a certain place in a social order and must be moved or put in its rightful place. So, what Hall states is that drawing on Mary Douglas, certain matter is out of place, and uh, a lot of politics and a lot of societal norms involve placing the matter in its place. So you don't worry about dirt in the garden, writes Hall. You worry about dirt in the bedroom, and you have to find ways to clean it, to purge it, to prevent it from coming back. And this, for Hall, is also the way that race is organized societally. So discrimination, being racial, being racialized, or even being a victim of a hate crime is also about place and matter in or out of place. So someone could be the norm in a certain country, or someone could be middle class in a certain neighborhood. But if they move somewhere else, will they remain in place? So the work of race, I would argue, is also uh, the work of classification, and it is very anthropological in nature. The dirt in the garden and dirt in the bedroom idea from Hall is also about sex and sexual difference. Um, the dirt in the bedroom could be used as a metaphor for thinking or for critically considering the ways that race informs our most intimate human relationships. Judith Butler writes that anti Black racism presents whiteness as the normal mode of humanness. So the anthropological gaze, which is often engaged in classification, can be used to construct norms. And what many scholars have argued is that when whiteness becomes a norm or a representation of all of humanity, um, the actual lives of people of color can be threatened. So, this normal mode of humanness allows us to expel or to banish or to purge others. And I think this is clear in the Black Lives Matter movement. Cornel West writes, "Justice is what love looks like in public." So I'll leave you with this quote and these ideas to consider. And hopefully, you will take something from the lecture. You will engage with the course readings and the course content because it is of interest to you. And hopefully, it will benefit your academic career and your intellectual development. Justice is what love looks like in public. Thank you.